Have you ever felt a chill run down your spine, even when you're alone? Tonight, that feeling might have a story to tell. Hello, I'm the Mesmer. No matter where you are, or what time it is, I'm here to guide you into a realm where shadows whisper and mysteries unfold. Leave your worries behind. Let your mind wander and drift into the unknown. Here, where shadows dance and secrets lie in wait, allow your thoughts to drift into a dream of mystery. Close your eyes, take a deep breath, and relax. If you enjoy this, don't forget to subscribe and share your thoughts. Let's begin. The night was dense with fog, a swirling veil of mist that clung to the towering oaks lining the desolate country road. Ethan Parker gripped the steering wheel of his aging sedan, his headlights barely piercing the thick darkness ahead. The rhythmic thumping of rain against the windshield formed a hypnotic pattern, lulling his mind into a strange, drowsy state as he navigated the narrow, winding path toward his new home. He had found the listing by chance, an old Victorian house on the outskirts of town, far from the suffocating buzz of city life. The price was absurdly low, almost suspiciously so, but for Ethan, a journalist who thrived on unraveling urban legends and supernatural mysteries, that only added to its appeal. He had spent years chasing stories of haunted mansions and restless spirits. Now he would live in one. As he turned onto the gravel driveway, the house loomed into view, its silhouette monstrous against the overcast sky. The two-story structure stood in eerie silence, its wooden frame worn and tired, the faded blue paint peeling like dead skin. A gabled roof, bowed slightly from decades of wear, loomed over the front porch, where a rusted wind chime swayed in the breeze, producing a hollow, discordant melody. Ethan exhaled slowly, suppressing the creeping unease slithering up his spine. He had seen plenty of abandoned houses before, but there was something different about this one. It wasn't just old. It felt forgotten, as if time itself had turned away from it. He killed the engine, stepping out onto the damp earth. The air was thick with the scent of rain-soaked wood and something else, something faintly metallic. A shiver ran through him, but he shook it off. Just his imagination, he told himself. The wooden steps groaned under his weight as he climbed onto the porch, testing each plank cautiously. He reached into his coat pocket, fishing out the key the landlord had mailed him. As he inserted it into the rusted lock, a voice behind him made him startle. "You must be the new tenant." Ethan turned sharply, his heart lurching in his chest. An elderly man stood at the foot of the porch steps, his face a road map of deep lines and creases. His eyes, dark and knowing, held a weight that made Ethan's stomach tighten. "Yeah," Ethan replied, forcing his voice to remain steady. "Ethan Parker, I just moved in." The old man nodded slowly. "Name's Walter. Used to live next door, before they tore it down." Ethan frowned. "Tore it down?" Walter exhaled, the sound almost a sigh. "House wasn't right. Things happened there, same as this one." A flicker of unease returned. "What kind of things?" The old man hesitated before speaking again. "Don't go poking around where you shouldn't." His gaze lifted toward the second floor, where a single dormer window peeked out from the attic. "Especially up there." Ethan followed his gaze, squinting through the rain. The attic window was dusty, its glass distorted with age, giving the impression of something shifting just beyond its surface. A trick of the light, he reasoned. "Why?" he asked, turning back to Walter. The old man's lips pressed into a thin line. "Just don't." And with that, Walter turned and shuffled away, disappearing into the mist like a specter retreating into the void. Ethan lingered on the porch for a moment, his fingers still curled around the doorknob. The house groaned softly, as if breathing in anticipation. He shook his head, dismissing the thought, and turned the key. The door swung open with a long, drawn-out creak, revealing a cavernous darkness beyond. The air inside was stale, carrying the faint scent of old wood, dust, and something else. Something faintly rotten. Ethan stepped over the threshold, flicking on the flashlight he had brought with him. The beam cut through the gloom, illuminating the grand wooden staircase in the center of the foyer. Its banister was intricately carved but worn, the deep mahogany dulled by years of neglect. The wallpaper that once adorned the walls in elegant patterns now curled at the edges, peeling away in long, yellowed strips. White sheets draped over old furniture cast ghostly shapes throughout the parlor, their contours illuminated by the flickering glow of his light. As he moved further inside, the wooden floor beneath his boots let out faint creaks, as if whispering secrets long forgotten. He explored methodically. The parlor, the kitchen, a study filled with books that had succumbed to decay. Each room was steeped in history, as if the walls themselves had absorbed the echoes of lives once lived within them. But one room felt different. At the end of the upstairs hallway, a single door stood shut, different from the others. Where the other rooms had doors left ajar, this one was firmly closed. The brass handle gleamed in the flashlight's glow, untouched by dust. Ethan reached out, fingers brushing against the metal. It was ice cold. A draft seeped from underneath the door, carrying a scent that made his stomach churn. Damp, musty, with the unmistakable undercurrent of something foul. He hesitated, then tried the handle. Locked. He exhaled, stepping back. The attic. Walter's warning echoed in his mind, but he pushed it aside. Superstition. That's all it was. Whatever was in that attic, it wasn't ghosts or demons. It was just an old, forgotten space. And yet, as he turned to head back to his room for the night, he could have sworn he heard something. A faint rustling, like fabric shifting against wood. He paused, flashlight trembling slightly in his grip. Silence. Ethan let out a quiet chuckle, shaking his head. His mind was playing tricks on him. The house was old. It made sounds. That was all. Yet, as he lay in bed later that night, listening to the wind rattling the windows and the distant hoot of an owl, he couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't alone. Somewhere within the dark recesses of the house, something was waiting. And it had been waiting for a very long time. The rain drummed softly against the windshield as Ethan Parker navigated his aging sedan down a winding country road, its edges lined with towering oaks and skeletal pines. The house had been listed at an unbelievably low price, almost suspiciously so. But for a journalist like Ethan, who specialized in abandoned places and supernatural stories, that only made it more intriguing. He had been searching for a quiet place, somewhere he could live while working on his latest book, a collection of true ghost stories. This house, with its Victorian architecture and isolated location on the outskirts of town, seemed like the perfect setting. As he turned onto the gravel driveway, the house loomed into view. A two-story structure with faded blue paint peeling from its wooden walls. Its gabled roof seemed to sag under the weight of time. The windows, dark and empty, stared back at him like hollow eyes. A rusted wind chime dangled by the porch, clinking eerily in the evening breeze. Despite its decay, the house held a certain charm, the kind that whispered of secrets long buried. Ethan stepped out of his car, stretching his legs after the long drive.
The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and something faintly metallic. He made his way up the creaking wooden steps, testing each one cautiously before reaching the door. As he inserted the key, a voice behind him startled him. "You must be the new tenant," said an elderly man standing at the bottom of the steps. His weathered face was set in deep lines, eyes dark and knowing. "Name's Walter. Used to live next door before they tore it down." Ethan nodded politely. "Ethan Parker, journalist. I guess you know the house pretty well then." Walter exhaled sharply. "Enough to warn you. Don't go poking around where you shouldn't, especially the attic." He pointed to the upper level of the house, where a single dormer window peeked out, dusty and untouched. Ethan raised an eyebrow. "Why?" Walter shook his head. "Just don't." Before Ethan could press further, the old man turned and shuffled away, disappearing down the road. The encounter left him with a nagging unease, but he shrugged it off and stepped inside. The interior was just as he had expected. Dusty, worn, but still sturdy. A grand wooden staircase curved toward the second floor, and the scent of aged wood and forgotten memories filled the space. Old furniture remained, covered in white sheets like ghosts frozen in time. The wallpaper, once vibrant, was now faded and peeling in long, curling strips. As he explored, he found a study filled with decaying books, a kitchen with rusted appliances, and a master bedroom with an old-fashioned four-poster bed. The only room that seemed out of place was the attic door at the end of the upstairs hallway. Unlike the other doors, which were slightly ajar, this one was locked tight. The brass handle was ice-cold to the touch, and a peculiar draft seeped from underneath. Ethan felt a shiver run down his spine, but dismissed it as the house settling. It was just another job, another house with a past. He would document its story, debunk any rumors, and move on. Yet, as he lay in bed that night, he couldn't shake the feeling that the house was watching him back.
The first morning in the house was cloaked in an eerie stillness. Ethan awoke to the pale light of dawn filtering through the dusty curtains, painting ghostly streaks across the wooden floor. The air was damp and heavy, carrying the scent of aged wood and something faintly metallic, a smell that clung to the house like an old memory. He sat up, rubbing the sleep from his eyes, his body stiff from the worn mattress. The previous night's unease still lingered at the edge of his mind, but curiosity outweighed his apprehension. He had chosen this house for a reason: to document its past, uncover whatever secrets lay buried within its walls. Ethan threw on a sweater and stepped out into the hallway. The silence was suffocating. His footsteps echoed as he moved, disturbing the thick layer of dust that had settled on the wooden planks. The walls, adorned with peeling floral wallpaper, seemed to close in around him as he made his way toward the main staircase. The house creaked as if shifting beneath his weight, each step sending a soft groan through the structure. He descended slowly, his eyes flicking toward the attic door at the end of the hall. The brass handle gleamed in the dim morning light, its surface untouched by time. He resisted the urge to try it again. Not yet. Instead, he made his way to the kitchen. The space was frozen in time, a relic of decades past. Rusted appliances sat unused, their surfaces coated in a thin layer of grime. A wooden table occupied the center of the room, surrounded by mismatched chairs, their cushions sagging with age. A single bulb hung from the ceiling, unlit, its pull chain swaying slightly as if recently disturbed. Ethan traced his fingers over the surface of the table.
his mind constructing a scene from the past. A family gathered around for breakfast, laughter echoing against the walls. But that warmth was long gone, replaced by the oppressive silence of abandonment. He opened a few cabinets, finding only dust and cobwebs. The sink, encrusted with rust, dripped occasionally, the sound unnervingly loud in the otherwise quiet house. Then, a noise, a faint, rhythmic tapping from above. Ethan froze, his pulse quickening. He turned his gaze toward the ceiling, listening intently. The sound was light, almost hesitant, like fingertips drumming against wood. It came from the attic. He swallowed hard, his rational mind scrambling for an explanation. Settling beams, an animal, the wind. Yet something about it felt deliberate. It stopped just as suddenly as it had begun, leaving an unsettling silence in its wake. Shaking off the unease, he turned his attention to the rest of the house. He moved through the parlor, where sheets still covered forgotten furniture, their shapes distorted beneath the fabric. Dust motes swirled in the air as he lifted a sheet, revealing an ornate wooden chair, its upholstery torn and faded. A fireplace stood against the far wall, its stone mantel cracked but still imposing. A set of framed photographs sat atop the mantel, their glass cracked and yellowed with age. Ethan picked one up, brushing away the dust. The image was of a family, a father, mother, and 2 children, their faces frozen in time. Their eyes, even in the faded photograph, seemed to hold an unspoken sorrow. Something about the picture unsettled him. He placed it back carefully and turned away. Moving to the study, he found shelves filled with books, their spines cracked and pages brittle. Many were unreadable, their titles lost to time, but one caught his eye. A leather-bound journal, its cover embossed with an intricate floral pattern. He opened it, skimming the first few pages. The handwriting was elegant but faded, detailing mundane daily events, weather observations, grocery lists, appointments. Then, toward the middle of the journal, the tone shifted. The noises are back. I told Henry, but he doesn't hear them. They come at night, always the same. 3 knocks, then silence. 3 knocks, then silence. I don't dare open the attic, not after what happened to Peter. Ethan's breath hitched. He flipped the pages frantically, but much of the ink had faded, the remaining words fragmented and incoherent. He turned to the last entry, the writing now shaky and uneven. It watches. It waits. I can feel it when I close my eyes. The page ended there. No explanation. No resolution. Ethan closed the journal slowly, his skin crawling. The weight of the house pressed down on him, the silence no longer comforting, but suffocating. He exhaled sharply, shaking his head. He had spent years chasing ghost stories. This was just another one, another mystery waiting to be solved. Yet, deep down, he couldn't ignore the growing unease in his gut. He would stay. He would document. And eventually, he would uncover the truth. But as he turned toward the attic door once more, he couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, was waiting for him to do just that. The first few nights passed in uneasy silence, the kind that pressed against the walls and filled the empty rooms with an unseen presence. The house had settled around Ethan, yet something about it felt off, like a misplaced memory lurking at the edge of his mind. His days were spent documenting the house's decay, taking notes on its architecture and the eerie atmosphere that seemed woven into its very foundation. But as night fell, the house whispered to him in ways he could not ignore. The first incident was small. A book he had left on the coffee table in the study was no longer there in the morning. He found it later on the dining room table, its pages splayed open to an entry about early colonial settlements. He brushed it off, attributing it to exhaustion. Yet a nagging thought settled in his mind. Had he moved it and forgotten? Then came the sounds, faint at first, mere rustlings in the walls, as if the house was breathing. At night, he would lie in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening. The soft creaks of floorboards that seemed to follow an invisible path, stopping just outside his bedroom door. He told himself it was nothing, just the old wood shifting in the cold. But then, the knocking began. It always came in threes, soft, deliberate, a pattern that wormed its way into his thoughts, lodging there like a thorn. The first time, he sat upright in bed, waiting, his breath caught in his throat. The sound had come from the attic door. He had spent years debunking ghost stories, dismissing them as coincidences or exaggerations. But this was something else. The attic door remained shut in the morning, its brass handle as untouched as before. Yet the feeling of intrusion lingered. He set up small tests. A pile of dust at the threshold, a chair wedged against it. The next night, the knocking returned, and in the morning, the dust was disturbed, the chair slightly askew. The house was awake. A cold draft slithered through the halls, even when the windows remained closed. Shadows stretched too long in the corners of his vision. He started seeing smudges on the bathroom mirror, faint outlines of what looked like fingerprints appearing overnight. He wiped them away, only to have them return by dusk. Then came the voices. Not words, not conversations, just the impression of something speaking, just beyond the range of comprehension. A murmur beneath the floorboards, a whisper carried by the wind through the rafters. It filled the silence of the house with an oppressive weight, turning even the daylight hours into something tense and unwelcome. One evening, as he stood in the hallway staring at the attic door, something shifted above him. A slow, dragging sound, like fabric being pulled across wood. His pulse quickened. He told himself it was an animal, some stray raccoon that had found its way inside. But he knew better. Ethan took a deep breath and backed away. He wasn't ready yet. Not to open it. Not to acknowledge what he already feared. The air inside the house grew heavier with each passing day, as though the walls themselves were thickening, absorbing time and space. The outside world felt more distant than ever. Ethan had lost signal on his phone days ago, and attempts to reconnect to the internet yielded nothing. Every time he tried the landline in the study, he was met with static, sometimes interrupted by faint, unintelligible murmurs. His world had shrunk to the boundaries of the house, and the silence inside had taken on an unnatural weight. Each floorboard creak felt purposeful, as if responding to his own movements. At times, he would turn a corner or glance at a mirror, only to catch the fleeting suggestion of movement, something slipping just beyond his field of vision. The attic door became an obsession. By day, he resisted the urge to investigate, telling himself it was nothing more than an old house settling. By night, he lay awake, listening to the sounds emanating from above. The rustling had grown more distinct, fabric against wood, the occasional soft scrape like fingertips along the floorboards. The knocking pattern remained, always in threes, always at irregular hours. Stranger still were the objects that seemed to move of their own accord. His notes, carefully laid out in the study, would be shuffled the next morning. some pages missing entirely. His flashlight, which he distinctly remembered leaving on the kitchen counter, reappeared beside his bed. At first, he questioned his own memory, but the feeling of being manipulated became undeniable. One evening, as he descended the staircase toward the foyer, he noticed something new. A picture frame, previously hanging straight, was now tilted at an angle. He adjusted it absently, only to find it askew again the next morning. The power outages started soon after. At first, they were brief. A flicker, a momentary plunge into darkness. Then, they grew longer, forcing him to rely on candles. The glow of the flames cast elongated shadows that wavered unnaturally along the walls, stretching and contorting like living things. And then there was the photograph. One night, in a desperate attempt to find some logical explanation, Ethan dug through a cabinet in the study, pulling out stacks of old papers. Among them was a photograph, faded and curled at the edges. It depicted a family standing in front of the house. The father had his arm around the mother, and between them stood a child. The three figures were worn and blurred with time. But there was something else. Something wrong. A fourth figure stood in the attic window, a shadowy silhouette barely discernible against the dusty glass. No details, no features, just a presence, watching from above. Ethan's breath turned shallow. He turned the photograph over. In faint, delicate handwriting, a single date was scrawled. October 13th, 1957. The realization hit him with a sickening weight. This house had been abandoned for decades before he arrived. The previous owners hadn't merely moved out. They had vanished. He turned toward the attic door. The sensation of being watched intensified, an unshakable certainty pressing down on him. Something was waiting, and it was growing impatient. The house was no longer content with whispers and shadows. It wanted him to see. Ethan had spent days circling the attic door, hesitating, always finding an excuse to delay. But the house was relentless. The knocking had grown more insistent, the whispers more distinct, the movements in his periphery no longer subtle. The sense of being watched no longer ebbed. It pressed on him, suffocating. On the fifth night, after another failed attempt to sleep, he decided it was time. He retrieved his flashlight, his hands clammy as he traced the curve of the brass handle. It was colder than before, as if the door itself was resisting him. The air around him felt thick, almost charged with something unseen. He exhaled, steadied himself, and twisted the handle. It gave way too easily. The lock had always been secured, but now it opened as though it had never been locked at all. The attic stairs creaked under his weight as he ascended, the smell of damp wood and dust thick in the air. The darkness swallowed him, his flashlight beam slicing through the gloom, revealing old trunks, discarded furniture, and cobwebbed rafters. A feeling of displacement settled over him, as if he had stepped into a space untouched by time. Then he saw it. A large mirror stood against the far wall, draped in a heavy cloth. The fabric swayed slightly, though there was no breeze. Ethan's pulse quickened. He had read enough about haunted houses to recognize the trope, but seeing it in reality was different. It radiated something wrong. The whispering grew louder, though still indecipherable. He reached out, fingers trembling, and pulled the cloth away. The mirror revealed his reflection, or what should have been his reflection. The figure staring back had his face, his eyes, his stance, but it was off. The head tilted at an unnatural angle, the mouth curled, not in a smile, but in something close to recognition. Ethan's breath hitched. He took a step back. The reflection did not. Then, the thing in the mirror moved on its own. It raised a hand, placing it against the glass. Ethan felt his body tense as an invisible force gripped him, an unnatural pull emanating from the mirror's depths. The whispers turned into an overwhelming chorus, unintelligible but deafening. His vision blurred. His feet lifted off the ground. The mirror began to ripple, and the world twisted around him. He tried to scream, but the sound was swallowed whole. Everything went black.
Ethan's consciousness wavered between reality and something far darker. His body felt weightless, like it was being dragged through an invisible current, submerged in something thick and suffocating. He gasped, but the air refused to fill his lungs. The world around him twisted, a swirl of distorted shapes and flickering lights, bending as if reality itself was fracturing. His vision cleared just enough for him to see the mirror again, but he was no longer standing in the attic. He was inside it. A silent scream clawed at his throat as he slammed his fists against the cold, glass-like barrier separating him from the real world. Beyond it, the attic stood unchanged, untouched by the chaos he now found himself trapped in. And in front of the mirror, outside, in his world, stood something wearing his face. The reflection was no longer an imitation. It had stepped forward, out of the mirror, and now occupied his place. Ethan watched, paralyzed with horror, as it flexed its fingers, rolling its shoulders, adjusting to its new form. Its smile widened, a grotesque mimicry of human expression, the eyes gleaming with something ancient and wrong. Ethan pounded on the barrier. The sound swallowed into the void surrounding him. The air inside the mirror world was stifling, pressing against him like unseen hands. He turned, looking for anything, any escape. But there was nothing. Only endless darkness stretching beyond the mirror's frame. His heartbeat thundered in his ears. Outside, the doppelganger turned its gaze toward him, tilting its head as if listening. Then, with deliberate slowness, it raised a hand and placed it against the glass. A sharp, searing pain erupted in Ethan's chest. He gasped, clutching his ribs, but his hands met nothing solid. His body was losing definition, his form dissolving into the swirling abyss of the mirror's prison. The thing outside was taking his place, and he was fading, becoming nothing more than a shadow, trapped in the reflection. He wouldn't let it end like this. Summoning every ounce of strength left in his failing form, Ethan slammed his palms against the mirror, pushing back against the force trying to erase him. The surface wavered, rippling like water. The doppelganger's expression faltered, its movement suddenly stiff, uncertain. A crack formed at the edge of the glass, jagged and deep. Ethan felt a pull, this time, not dragging him deeper, but pushing him out. He lunged, throwing himself toward the surface as the world shattered around him. A deafening crack split the air as Ethan tumbled forward, landing hard on the attic floor. Cold, solid wood met his palms. The suffocating weight lifted, and the stifling darkness receded. He gasped for breath, filling his lungs with the musty, stale air of the attic. The mirror lay in shards around him, its once polished surface reduced to nothing but jagged remnants. The thing that had tried to take his place was gone. There was no reflection, no lingering presence. But something felt wrong. He pushed himself up, every muscle trembling with exhaustion. His hands hurt, and when he looked down, tiny cuts marred his skin, thin rivulets of blood tracing down his fingers. He turned to the broken mirror, his breath catching in his throat.
His reflection was still there. The pieces of glass scattered around him still held his image, but they weren't following his movements. Each fragment showed something different. His face frozen in expressions he hadn't made. His eyes staring back with a silent, knowing malice. And then, in one of the larger shards, his reflection smiled. Ethan's body felt hollow, like a discarded shell. He stumbled back, gasping for breath, his fingers digging into the wooden floor as his mind reeled. The attic around him seemed unchanged, but something inside him was irreversibly different. The shattered mirror lay in jagged pieces at his feet, yet within them, his reflection remained whole. He reached out hesitantly to a shard, but the reflection didn't mirror him. Instead, it moved of its own accord. The frozen image of himself inside the broken glass smirked, a slow, knowing expression that sent a jolt of terror through Ethan's chest. The thing in the mirror was still there, still watching. A flickering sense of wrongness gnawed at him. His mind struggled to reconcile what had just happened. He had felt himself being pulled, felt reality twisting around him, but he had escaped. Hadn't he? With trembling hands, he gathered the larger shards of glass, turning them in the dim light of the attic. Each one contained a different version of his face, some terrified, others blank, and one in a sliver of glass no larger than his palm, grinning unnaturally wide. His breath hitched. That wasn't a reflection of his face. It was something else entirely. Ethan staggered to his feet, his heartbeat hammering against his ribs. He had to get out. The air in the attic was thick, suffocating. He turned, reaching for the door handle, when the whispering started again. Soft at first, a breath against his ear, then swelling into a chorus of murmurs that filled the room. His stomach clenched. A cold sensation wrapped around his wrist. He snapped his gaze down. His own shadow stretched unnaturally beneath him, its edges flickering like an image struggling to stay in focus. But it wasn't just his shadow. It moved, independent of him. A sharp pain seared through his arm, as if something invisible had latched onto him. He jerked back, stumbling against the wall, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, swirling in languages he couldn't understand. His vision wavered, the walls of the attic shifting subtly, as though the space itself was bending. Had he truly escaped the mirror, or had something else taken his place? Ethan pushed forward, forcing himself through the attic door and stumbling down the staircase. His legs felt heavy, as if he was walking against a force pulling him backward. He reached the ground floor, his hand fumbling for the doorknob. He needed to leave. Now the house refused to let him go. The front door, which had swung open so easily when he arrived, wouldn't budge. His fingers trembled as he twisted the lock, pounded on the wood, but it held firm, unyielding. His reflection in the glass panel of the door stared back at him. Not a perfect copy, but a warped, distorted version, its head tilting at an unnatural angle. His breathing grew erratic. The house wasn't the same. Or maybe he wasn't. Something had shifted, something fundamental. A creeping dread slithered into his mind. What if the entity in the mirror had succeeded? What if it had switched places with him after all? Ethan turned slowly, his eyes scanning the dimly lit hallway. The furniture looked the same. The walls, the floorboards, the staircase, unchanged. And yet, it all felt wrong, like a replica of his world, a near-perfect imitation, but hollow, artificial. A chill prickled along the back of his neck. Footsteps echoed above. His heart stilled. They were slow, deliberate, moving along the attic floor, the same attic he had just fled. His mind screamed at him to run, but his body remained frozen. The footsteps reached the top of the stairs. Then, ever so gradually, they descended. Step by step, closer. Ethan finally broke free of his paralysis. He stumbled backward, eyes locked on the staircase. The dim light from the hallway flickered, shadows stretching unnaturally along the walls. He swallowed hard, forcing himself to move toward the study. There had to be another way out. A back door, a window, anything. As he reached the study, he hesitated. His typewriter sat on the desk where he had left it. Beside it, his notes, his journal entries, and resting on top was the old photograph he had found days before, the one of the family in front of the house. Only now, there was something new in the picture. A figure stood in the attic window, unmistakable despite its blurred edges, and it was staring directly at him. Ethan's blood turned to ice. The whispers returned, now all around him, closing in, pressing against his skull. He stumbled back from the desk, his breath coming in sharp, shallow gasps. The shadows along the walls twisted, elongating, as if reaching for him. The mirror may have shattered, but the entity hadn't been destroyed. It was still here, and it was waiting for him to realize the truth.
Ethan's breath came in ragged gasps, his hands shaking as he traced the sigils he had hurriedly sketched onto the wooden attic floor. Symbols pulled from the tattered journal he had found in the study. Old cryptic markings scrawled by hands long forgotten. He didn't know if they would work, but he had no other choice. The mirror, though shattered, still pulsed with an unnatural energy. The largest fragment, propped against the far wall, continued to hold the shifting image of his doppelganger. It stared at him, expression unreadable, its head tilting slightly as if in quiet amusement. A single beam of moonlight filtered through the attic window, striking the broken glass, causing the surface to ripple like disturbed water. The air thickened, pressing in around Ethan as the temperature dropped, his breath escaping in ghostly puffs. This was his moment. Ethan stepped closer to the mirror shard, ignoring the way his reflection remained motionless, watching. He knelt before it, placing his hands on the floor, aligning himself with the symbols. His pulse pounded in his ears as he whispered the words from the journal, syllables foreign and rough against his tongue. The sigils glowed faintly, the light snaking toward the mirror like veins of molten silver. The reflection twitched. For the first time, its smirk faltered. Ethan felt it. The pull reversing, the shift in balance, the cold grip around his soul loosening as something else. Something unseen began to take hold. His skin prickled with electricity, his vision doubling as the mirror's surface convulsed violently. He was winning. The reflection's hand shot up, palm pressing flat against the glass. Its face twisted, no longer amused, but filled with something else. Anger. Desperation. Ethan pressed forward, every fiber of his being straining toward the surface, feeling himself break free from the prison that had nearly consumed him. Then, the reflection's mouth moved. No sound came, but Ethan knew what it had said. Not yet. A force stronger than before slammed into him, knocking him backward. The sigils flickered, their glow snuffed out like candle flames in the wind. The mirror darkened, its surface no longer fluid, but solid, impenetrable. Ethan gasped, scrambling to his feet, lunging forward.
But it was too late. The reflection smiled again. This time it was cruel. Then slowly, deliberately, it turned away from the glass and walked into the world beyond. The world outside the mirror felt real. Too real. Ethan adjusted his collar, rolling his shoulders as if settling into a new skin. The air smelled the same. The wood beneath his feet groaned familiarly, and the distant hum of night insects remained unchanged. Yet, as he moved through the house, there was an eerie precision in his steps, a deliberate calculation behind his every motion. He descended the staircase, fingers brushing the banister, relishing the sensation. Everything was his now. In the study, he found Ethan's journal, flipping through its pages. The real Ethan had left behind a detailed account of his descent into fear, his unraveling sanity. The handwriting grew increasingly erratic toward the end. Scrawled words of desperation, pleas for understanding. Useless now. The book snapped shut. A knock echoed from the front door. He turned slowly, the familiar creak of the floorboards under his feet, sending a chill down his spine. Except this time, it wasn't fear. It was amusement. He opened the door to find Walter standing there, his deep-set eyes scanning Ethan with quiet scrutiny. "You look different." Walter's voice was cautious, but there was an edge of knowing beneath it. Ethan smiled, practiced, confident. "Just tired. The house takes some getting used to." Walter lingered for a moment, his gaze drifting past Ethan and into the darkened house. Then, without another word, he gave a slow nod and walked away, disappearing into the night. Back inside, Ethan turned toward the hallway mirror. The glass was intact, its surface marred only by a few faint scratches. He stepped closer, peering into it, waiting. The real Ethan was still there, trapped behind the glass, his fists pounding silently, his mouth forming desperate, soundless words. His eyes, wide, pleading, searched for recognition, for some way to break free. But there was no escape. Ethan exhaled, adjusting his reflection's collar one last time before turning away. Behind him, the trapped figure inside the mirror began to scream. Walter watched Ethan from a distance, his wrinkled hands tightening around the handle of his cane. Something was wrong. The young man moved the same, spoke the same, but there was an absence, an emptiness behind his eyes. It was subtle, just enough to unsettle the old man, like watching an actor performing a role they hadn't quite mastered. Down the street, Ethan's old friend, Daniel, sat across from him at a cafe, stirring his coffee absent-mindedly. He had known Ethan for years, long enough to recognize when something was off. The way he held his cup, the way he spoke with just a fraction of a second's hesitation before responding. It wasn't right. A creeping unease settled in Daniel's stomach as he watched his friend smile at him, but the expression never quite reached his eyes. That night, in the silence of his rented house, Ethan stood before the mirror in the dim light, tilting his head as he studied his own reflection. There were no visible differences, nothing anyone would notice at first glance, but he knew. And the real Ethan, trapped within the depths of the mirror, knew too. Behind the glass, the reflection had not faded. It remained, staring out, its fists pressed against the inside of the mirror, mouth open in a soundless scream. No one would ever hear him. No one would ever know. Days passed, then weeks. The mirror, once shattered, was replaced. The house stood still again, patient, waiting, In an old newspaper archive, a forgotten article resurfaced, one detailing the history of the house, a pattern of disappearances, tenants who moved in and were never seen again, neighbors who recalled strange shifts in behavior, as though the people who left were not the same ones who had arrived. And so, the house waited. One day, another tenant would come, and the knocking from inside the mirror would begin once more. If this world of mystery has captivated you, be sure to like and comment with the tales you'd love to hear next. Don't forget to subscribe and join me again in the quiet of the night for more journeys into the unknown.